here at a conference like this passionate about the work that we do, and often that goes without saying, but I think it can be important to hear those stories. And also because one of the themes of this conference that I've heard, and perhaps it's with the CEC perspective that we bring to this, but is that it's important to hear from leaders from all over the world and in different generations, and in particular young leaders. And I know at least Julie and Ilva are involved in some of the young leader conversations that are happening, and just wanted to give a chance for each of the panelists, and we know Ibrahim is young, so to just share with us a minute or two on what brings them to this work, and as from that perspective, that leadership perspective that they've all taken on in this, where they get the most sense of hope going forward. So, Ilva, do you want to start? We'll just maybe go down the line.
Sure. So, why I do what I do, and
yes.
What's the passion? All right. I had to think about this yesterday. So my background in agriculture is not very strong, apart from half of my family are farmers back home in Sweden, where I'm from. I didn't study agronomics. I studied international business. But I did decide to join an agricultural company because I think it's the forgotten business sector. It's why we settled. It's the foundation of most of our societies. And it's the foundation of our economies. I think it's a shame that it's often not seen as a business, but something that people do. When we have some of our, so in my team back at Syngenta, when we talk about what we want to actually achieve, public policy around agriculture, there's a lot of talk about how it can make farming being an attractive job or opportunity, or moving away from that often farming is seen as something that is not highly skilled or professional, where as a matter of fact it is. I would love to see more recognition for the work that farmers are doing, and people understand where the food are coming from, and what kind of work and labor and resources that go into this. This is for me a very important topic. And also, I think that the innovations around agriculture and technologies are not understood well enough. And I think that's a conversation to be had. It has started. I think we have changed the way that we talk about agriculture over the last couple of years in general, the global society. But I think it's a very important discussion to be had. So that's the reason why I feel very strongly about the industry I work for.
Thanks so much. Julie?
So I guess my evolution towards working in the agriculture arena started with falling in love with nature, plug for Dominic and the work he's trying to do at the Congress, capturing people's stories on that topic. But then from there I studied natural science, and then I taught natural science, and then I became interested in policy on environmental issues. And when I was coming out of graduate school and trying to think about where I wanted to work relative to environmental policy issues, I really wasn't sure, and so I was drawn to working in kind of an independent facilitator role and working with different stakeholders and kind of constantly learning from their perspectives. And so when I joined the Keystone Center, I wasn't joining necessarily to work on agriculture issues, but that was a big piece of the portfolio at the time, and it became really clear very quickly that agriculture is really an integrator issue. I mean, I think as you've heard from all of us, it touches on everything from energy use to water use to soils and wildlife. And so I think that's what keeps it lively and interesting for me. And by getting to work with the people I work with, I think I constantly am challenged on trying to understand diverse perspectives and opinions, and I think it is a great seat to sit in terms of working with the experts like those that surround me here. So.
Thanks. Well, aside from coming from the pig capital of the United States, which is quite a small number of us can say that. My links to agriculture actually are not very long or extensive. But having said that, I've spent my entire career pushing the conservation community into uncomfortable conversations with sectors, economic sectors, that we need to engage with. So I've spent most of my career actually in IUCN working with extractive sectors, with mining, oil and gas. And in that work with the extractive sectors, often the extractive sectors would come up with a question, well, why not deal with agriculture? I mean, come on, they have a bigger footprint than we do on the planet. My response was always, let's focus on what you can control, and you clearly can't control the agriculture sector, so let's get back to work. But in fact, actually, having recently moved to Tanzania and got my first-hand view of what's happening with farming and agriculture production in Africa, I'm seeing that the agriculture systems and the changes that are afoot in the agriculture systems are something that we desperately need to engage with. And here, hats off to Keith and the work that he's been doing over the last 2 years to really raise this on the IUCN community agenda and get a focused attention. And it's great to see the IUCN program now bringing food security solidly into the conversation of the conservation community, because if we don't address the agriculture question as a conservation community, then we won't be able to conserve the habitats of the species that we care about. We won't be able to conserve the water systems, the forest resources that we all depend on, and we won't be able to get to a green growth economy. So we need to engage, and we need to have some of those uncomfortable conversations, but we need to have them with open minds, and that's my way of working, and that's where I'm coming from.
I have been thinking how I would respond to this question. It's very simple for me. It's my veins. I was born in a small village, so I was not fortunate to be born in a clinic or even in a medical center. And at the age of 7, 8, the Sahel region where I came from was hit by a severe drought. I wouldn't say the first drought, but the first drought of this era. And I saw hundreds of animals, cows from my family, basically disappear from month to another. We lost everything. And luckily we had some land, and my family, then concentrated activity on food production. And that opened my eyes and said, there is something wrong here. I was 7 or 8. At the age of 9, 10, I had made my mind on what I need to do. And I haven't changed since.
Thank you. Thank you all for sharing that. We did get the advantage of asking Ibrahim if he was comfortable answering that question, but I was able to ask the other panelists yesterday if they would be willing to share their stories. And again, this is very telling, I think, of the conversation writ large happening in agriculture, of everybody from Ibrahim, who's experienced personal loss and challenge associated with this, to those who are really starting to look from different perspectives at solutions. And we often ask this conversation in agriculture conversations, and it is humbling to be one of the few who doesn't say, well, I grew up on the 4th generation of my farm, and now I'm not farming, but I'm in this business because I really care about seeing that. And that's a huge transformation, at least in the United States, that we see, and I think it's actually happening throughout the world, that those who've grown up in rural and pastoral environments are now contributing in other and different ways. Just as Ibrahim is no doubt getting his hands dirty every day at UNET, but is getting deep into the issues nonetheless. So I think very telling about where we're headed with agriculture and the types of folks who are starting to engage with this. At this point, what I'd like to do is just see if there are any questions from the audience for our panelists, or comments that that folks had. And if you could just step up to one of the mics here, that way we can make sure everybody can hear you. And if you just say your name and who you're with before you ask your question, that'd be great. If you're with anyone.
Good morning. I'm Kefing Sissoko from Mali. First I was working for IEA, it's a National Institute for Agronomic Research, and also for CEC. But now I am IUCN representative in Mali. For contribution question, first I have to thank you the whole board, the relevant contribution about the issue. But I want to say, yes, food security have 4 pillars that he was saying now: availability, accessibility, stability, and also utilization. But the fundamental issue that we can also say is sustainability, which have also 3 pillars: social, economics, and environmental. So in this way, the important question that we can now answer, mainly for African agriculture, is are the smallholders use the relevant practice, the sustained practice? Because if not, that is a very good lack of agriculture in our countries. Secondly, our countries are implementing relevant food security policy in terms of access to market, land management, water management. That's also a very big issue to answer. I want to add about the area lacking consensus, the 8 questions, with how competition on resource issues, land and water mainly, can be better done without conflict. Because in our country, there is a very big competition on the resources, mainly land and water. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Any responses from our esteemed panelists?
Sure. Smallholders in Africa and the practices, I go back to something that Uvo said, which I totally agree with, which is there's a combination of both hard and soft technologies that's needed. The yield gaps in Africa are considerable and are another source of potential in the systems of increasing productivity. Just as one example, in the context of RED project, actually, a reduced emissions from deforestation and forest degradation project that we're running in northern Tanzania, we've managed to increase the yields on farm with by 8-fold, so 8 times as much product as was being produced before, and that's with the equivalent or less resource inputs than before. So, but it's better inputs, it's better timing of inputs, it's better use of the soils, better management of the soils, and it's basic technologies that are available sometimes at no cost or at very low cost to farmers. But it's a conscious farming effort that's needed, and it's a lot of work with farmers, individuals, in country, on site, in their land, on their land, to improve the technologies, the know-how, the experience. And that means that you can double production in Africa, perhaps triple production in Africa, without any extra land. And I would say that that's absolutely imperative to do, and to do urgently, because in fact what we're seeing in Africa is a rapid increase in land being taken for agriculture already, not because of investments in industrial agriculture production necessarily, but because of smallholder farming practices that are not restoring the soils and keeping the fertility on the land that they're producing. So in fact, it's not about dead zones. Well, it's about preventing dead zones and creating live zones in Africa. Absolutely. And policy is needed as part of the framework for that.
Thank you. And when Andrea was talking about new land being acquired for agriculture, what came to my mind is this issue of land grab. But I'm glad she did not go into that. We can spend another day discussing about that issue, which is absolutely crucial and is part of the discussions we need to have. Cannot say that all land acquisitions are bad, but most of the ones that I have seen in Africa are not done properly and are done at a cost, at a price, at a heavy cost to local farmers and smallholders in particular. So let me just very quickly comment on the issue of conflicts or access to resources and competition. Again, this is a crucial issue to the world, especially for Africa. What we have observed is that there are two main causes of conflicts as far as natural resources are concerned. One is when you have abundance of natural resources. It is a paradox, but look at the map in Africa where you have major conflicts. You have two types. One is areas where there is abundance of natural resources, as was the case in Sierra Leone, is now the case in DRC, and is the case in many other places. You have huge conflicts. Access to mining, access to land, access to forest products, access to oil and gas. And of course, that is also associated with the weak governance that you have in this country. So a combination of availability of resources and weak governance basically leads to conflicts. It's an explosive cocktail. Incidentally, most of the oil-producing countries in Africa have conflicts, are in conflicts. The second reason is scarcity of resources, and that is what he was referring to. Again, look at the map and look at the Sahel, see what is happening in Darfur, in many other places in Africa, where access to land, access to water in times of scarcity lead to conflicts. Again, the foundation for that is weak governance, local governance, regional governance, and national governance. Now, unfortunately, the governance in Africa is not great. There are not many countries in Africa where the governance is correct. Not to say that communities are not organized, as is the case in Darfur. On the contrary, they were very well organized in the 50s, and when the colonial system came, what they did was to establish national tribunals that were dealing with conflicts, which destroyed the traditional way of resolving conflicts. And all the traditional rulers were actually, disempowered, and the official administration created official tribunals that were hundreds of kilometers away from where the conflicts were happening. So people had no capacity to go to tribunals to resolve their conflicts. So that was accumulated, and with the population growth, at some point in time, you reach a tipping point where actually you have serious conflicts. Unfortunately, most of these conflicts he did not mention, but I'm sure it is the case in Mali as well. Most of these conflicts occur between people from two different tribes. One tribe doing essentially agriculture, the other tribe doing livestock. And since it is conflicts over the resources, which is compounded with conflicts, tribal conflicts or ethnic or whatever, then you have an explosive again. Again, that is what we saw in Niger 10, 15 years ago. Unfortunately, it is the case now in Mali, where the situation in the northern part of Mali was essentially created by a group from one ethnic group which felt that they are disempowered or have not been taken into account seriously, and it started from there. Now it is getting much more complicated, unfortunately. But the initial, the reason for that, and look at the conflict that occurred 20 years ago between Mauritania and Senegal started with one farmer and one herder fighting over access to a water point, led to an international conflict. Hundreds of thousands of people moved. Refugees have not still returned to their places. It started with one single problem. And unfortunately, this is how all conflicts occur. So it is something that we need to take into consideration very seriously. because our studies from around the world, this is now a worldwide study looking at conflicts over the last 50 years. 2/3 of conflicts around the world have a link to natural resources over the last 50 years. Unfortunately, only 1/3 of the peace agreements have elements of natural resources included in them. Now, if you have in one case, in one hand, you have the causes, and the other hand, the solutions do not take into consideration these causes, what happens? Relapse. So, on average, we have also observed that there are relapses in less than 2 years after the conflict, the peace agreement has been signed. Unfortunately, in the case of Sudan, it did not take more than 1 year before we saw another conflict occur. So, this is the situation.
Very good. Yes. Again, just who you are and where you're from would be great.
My name is Saifullah Khan. I am working as Associate Professor in Karachi University. I am from Pakistan.